And I'll give it a minute or so because we have vastly more RSVPs than have joined. I know it's a crazy day. Folks are in the midst of joining.
How many RSVPs did you end up with?
94.
That's great.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to give it 2 more minutes and then we'll start. If you are not a panelist and are not muted, I will be muting you. Well, welcome, everybody. So glad you are joining us today. I am Rachel Weintraub, Executive Director of the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards. We are so appreciative to partner with the Center for Progressive Reform in hosting this first webinar on Project 2025 and the regulatory process. CSS is a coalition of over 200 organizations united in the belief that an effective regulatory system is essential to protecting the public interest. CSS is co-chaired by Public Citizen and Consumer Federation of America, and our executive committee includes the AFL-CIO, the Center for Progressive Reform, the Economic Policy Institute, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Union of Concerned Scientists. The Center for Progressive Reform and the Coalition for Sensible Safeguards will be hosting a series of webinars, of which this is the first, about the impacts of Project 2025 on our nation's system of regulatory safeguards. In recent months, Americans have learned about the many ways that Project 2025 would demolish our constitutional system of checks and balances and threaten individual rights and freedoms. So far, though, an important part of the story has not been adequately told. How Project 2025 would continue the decades-long conservative campaign to hobble the federal regulatory system and the critical role it plays in our democracy and in ensuring a healthy, inclusive economy. We plan to discuss the impacts on numerous issue areas related to the regulatory process that are important to our community. If you are not a panelist, if you could mute your line, that would be great. Our webinar today will focus on provisions in Project 2025 aimed at the more traditional yet incredibly pernicious goal of bringing about the deconstruction of the regulatory system, including shrinking agency budgets, adding new rulemaking procedures that prevent agencies from carrying out their missions, and outsourcing and privatizing crucial aspects of agency work. First, a few logistical details. This webinar is being recorded. 2, please put your Zoom in speaker view so you can best see the speakers. 3, if you are not a panelist, please keep your video off and mute your microphone. And if you don't mute your microphone and we could hear you, I may have to mute it for you. And please use the chat to introduce yourself to indicate that you have a question after the initial round of questions. We will open questions to the audience after the initial round of questions, and please post in the chat that you would like to ask a question. I will call on you to ask the question or ask your question depending on how much time we have left. So please turn your video and audio on to ask the question and turn it off after the question has been answered. I am so grateful that our panelists are able to participate in this conversation today, and I will briefly introduce the panelists, but I urge you to look at their official bios because I really don't have time to share all of the key information and their key accomplishments. So these are real summaries of all of the work that they've done to protect the public interest. So first, James Goodwin. He's the policy director at the Center for Progressive Reform and really the brilliant mind behind this work. He joined CPR in May of 2008. Prior to joining CPR, James worked as a legal intern for the Environmental Law Institute and Ecologics Group, Inc. The Center for Progressive Reform is a nonprofit research and advocacy organization that conducts independent scholarly research and policy analysis and advocates for effective collective solutions to our most pressing societal challenges. Jeremy Simons is affiliated with the Environmental Protection Network and is a principal with Simons Public Affairs and is an environmental and political analyst and strategist dedicated to protecting the environment. Previously, Jeremy was the vice president of political affairs at the Environmental Defense Fund, where he led teams that advanced policy solutions to protect public health and the environment from global climate change, air pollution, and other threats. Prior to joining EDF in 2013, Jeremy served as Deputy Staff Director for the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, and Jeremy has 25 years of experience in energy and environmental policy. Don Kettle is a professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He previously served as dean in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Volcker Alliance, the Brookings Institution, and the Partnership for Public Service. Don Kettle specializes in public management and public policy. And Liz Borkowski is the managing director of the Jacobs Institute of Women's Health at the George Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health, managing editor of Women's Health Issues, the peer-reviewed journal of the Jacobs Institute of Women's Health, a researcher in the Department of Health Policy and Management, and a member of the GW Center of Excellence in Maternal and Child Health. Her areas of expertise include reproductive health and U.S. healthcare policy affecting women's health. From 2006 to 2014, Liz worked in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health on issues of occupational health policy, including access to paid sick, medical, and family leave. So as you can see, we have an incredibly well-versed panel. So grateful for your participation this morning. Let's get into it now. So, James, welcome. So while there has been a lot of attention to Project 2025, can you share with us what it is, who wrote it, what the goals are, why we're so focused on it right now?
Yeah, so properly understood, Project 2025 is nothing more and certainly nothing less than a presidential transition report. Most of our organizations, if you're in a nonprofit, produce these things. I know ours does, but this one went viral, right? And the reason this one went viral is because it is so comprehensive and it is so detailed. And the details are quite frightening, right? What this document spells out, well, let me, so the major component of Project 2025 is this massive 900-page long policy manifesto, right? And what it spells out, if you pull it all together, is a drastic overhaul of our federal government, if I can put it that way. And what it aspires to is rebuilding our democracy, our pluralistic democracy, into something more akin to an authoritarian regime, one that advances like a Christian nationalist vision or a Christian nationalist agenda. And so it's not just the goals that are scary, but how it actually seeks to achieve those goals that are really scary. And so, like I said, it has this 900-page policy manifesto, but it also has this, it's what's been called like a LinkedIn for conservatives, where they're going to find 20,000 vetted conservatives to eventually serve as like regular line level bureaucrats. in the administration, people who are going to be loyal to this vision and not necessarily to the Constitution when those two things conflict. The other part is they have this series of training videos, which some of which leaked, right? And that are on YouTube that are basically going to train or claim that they're going to train these folks to now run the federal bureaucracy. And then the last component is this thing that hasn't been made public yet. It's like the first 180-day agenda. This is going to be things like executive orders and stuff. Nobody's seen this stuff. We've heard rumors. For example, one of the things they're talking about is setting the stage for, I guess in this case, President Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act, which means he can use the military as essentially a police force. So this is all what Project 2025 does, taken together. It's written under the direction of the Heritage Foundation, extremely hard right organization, involved over 100 organizations in its drafting, and really claims to like reflect where the modern conservative movement is.
So James, some of the specific and severe and drastic consequences on particular rights and protections of the proposals embedded in Project 2025 have been identified and discussed, many by our allied organizations, covering specific issues, education, the environment, public health, but there's not been a lot of attention on the impact on the regulatory process. Can you identify what these proposals are?
Yeah, and I mean, there is just so much that's been written about Project 2025. And the way the report itself is structured is around agencies, right? There's a chapter on Department of Labor and Education and so forth. And most of the commentary, the public commentary is sort of reflected that structuring. And that all makes perfect sense, right? Because that's, you know, how a lot of us think about policy is in terms of like discrete substantive areas. But what you sort of miss is the cross-cutting stuff, right? And unless you were like one of the unfortunate people like myself to have actually read this thing, you miss that, right? And one of the things that so when you read through it, you see patterns that cut across the different chapters. And what these patterns are different ways that Project 2025 would attack the regulatory system, what all of us on this call care about. Because it's not just the Department of Education or the Department of Energy carrying out its mission, it's how they use the regulatory system to carry out that mission. And so the patterns that you see across the chapters are how Project 2025 effectively aims to prevent agencies from using this important governing institution to accomplish the public interest. So we're going to hear about examples of that today, but you know, for example, it's a lot of it is just standard issue stuff, right? Like cutting agency budgets. Conservatives have been calling for this kind of thing for a long time. Privatization, undermining expertise at agencies, and adding new rulemaking procedures, right? Essentially making it harder for agencies to do the kinds of things that Congress has told them to do.
Thanks, James. And that's a perfect segue to go to our next speaker and our next speakers in general, who are going to really focus on a lot of the issues that you identified. I'm going to turn now to Jeremy. Jeremy, you work with the Environmental Protection Network, an organization of 650 former EPA staff who volunteer their time to support EPA's mission. You recently issued a report on EPA regulations that highlight the stakes if Project 2025 is implemented at EPA. Walk us through what Project 2025 would mean for the Environmental Protection Agency and the regulations that it has put in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it on the webinar. So yeah, we recently, I mean, just to give a sense of the scale of the stakes here, this report that we released last week really took a look at trying to look not just at the individual rules, but across rules like what EPA has put in place in the last 3 years. And so we looked at 16 air pollution rules in particular to look at their health benefits. And you know what we found was quite frankly jaw-dropping. their EPA's accomplishments over the last 3 years has been nothing short of life-saving. These rules will save 200,000 lives through 2050 and prevent 100 million asthma attacks. And so all of this gets put at risk. I mean, you think about 200,000 people, it sounds like it's hard to envision a number, but like if you thought about it, it's a convoy of buses stretching from Philadelphia all the way along the highway to New York City. When we think about the families waiting for people to get off those buses, I mean, that's a lot of people who can live whole and healthy lives thanks to the actions of EPA. So Project 2025 is an attack on EPA. It includes a chapter, Lucky Chapter 13, written by former Chief of Staff at EPA under Donald Trump and other Trump appointees. And it's a blueprint for destruction that would take a wrecking ball, to the agency. It would put polluters in charge of the air we breathe and the water we drink, rather than the scientists and experts at EPA, and that's very deliberate. They really, it would be a mistake to think that that it won't get worse than what happened under Donald Trump in his previous term, when these people had their hands at the agencies, because they were on the reins of the agency, because they were essentially still in learning mode, and they stumbled a lot. And they're ready, they're now looking at that as a training ground, and Project 2025 is a much more reckless plan, even than the damage that was done previously. So the chapter, it includes things like eliminating the Environmental Justice Office that the Biden-Harris EPA has created, eliminating and relocating the enforcement office, and it envisions, along with the entire, rest of the government, this Schedule F, plan really looms large at EPA, in the notion that not only will experts be replaced by political hacks, but just the looming threat that any job could be reclassified will be used to really try to suppress and silence, I think, EPA staff. So they're going to try to hollow out the agency from within, if they get a second run or another run at this, and it's really disturbing to see.
So, Jeremy, many agencies have seen their budgets stagnate in recent years, even as their missions have actually done the opposite and grown larger. Nearly every chapter in Project 2025 calls for drastically cutting budgets, even more than they've been cut already. Can you talk about how these developments would affect EPA's ability to carry out its mission, and how it would undermine agency capacity to promulgate new rules?
Yeah. This is one of those areas that I think they probably learned their lessons from the first time around. When you read the report, the chapter on EPA, it becomes clear that they realize they're not going to get their way when it comes to the direct assault of slashing budgets through Congress. They tried that when they tried that in 2017 and 2018. They tried it again and again, and Congress largely rejected those cuts. But nevertheless, the agency budget stagnated, and that certainly led to some significant effects. So what they're going to do this time, sure, they'll propose cuts, but they're really planning on unilaterally implementing budget cuts at EPA by essentially freezing staffing, and then trying to drive staff out of the agency. And they're going to do this a lot of different ways, including the scientific suppression and the political oversight and censorship that I was talking about previously. But there's even plans in there like taking a page out of the book from what they did with BLM previously when they moved the headquarters. away from Washington, D.C., and a lot of really talented people left rather than try to make that move. There's a plan, for example, in the EPA chapter to try to relocate all the EPA regional offices. This is just one of many examples of basically how they're going to try to whittle away the agency, make life miserable for staff so they leave and then not hire replacements. Even in the face of congressional funding, they'll just basically will try to get it to the point where it can't be spent because they don't have the staff in place to do that. So for the regulatory agenda, you have a triple whammy. You have the direct rollbacks that will be ordered by the political operatives, and you have the staff being hollowed out and sort of and driven away from these not only budget cuts, but also just trying to make their lives impossible. And then you have the inability to fulfill the law. That EPA is required to update these standards, like many agencies are. They have a responsibility that they need to fulfill, but we're going to see that set aside.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Now over to Don. James mentioned in sort of the list of the ways that Project 2025 impacts the regulatory process, that one of those is privatization. Could you tell us what that actually means and provide some history about how it's been used as a so-called good government reform?
Sure. This privatization label is a fascinating one, and one of the problems is that, Rachel, it's kind of hard to answer the question to begin with because it means different things for different people. The major movements of reform through privatization, really, in the modern era, at least, can be dated back to the Reagan administration, where the administration created the Grace Commission, headed by J. Peter Grace, who was a prominent business leader, to bring what he said were business-like principles into government. And so what that really meant was, first, trying to identify programs that the government was doing that it ought to just get rid of. And of course, that's always difficult because the question of what government ought to be doing is more a political issue than an administrative one. Then there was an issue of trying to figure out how best to try to improve government's efficiency. And the underlying argument was that the private sector in general was always more efficient than the public sector because of the presence of competition. And so the idea was to, as many times as possible, to contract out what it is that government did. And so these days, for example, it's very difficult to go in any government lobby and find a government employee who's sitting there standing guard. The guards are almost all contracted out. It's very difficult to go into a government cafeteria and find individuals who work as government employees serving the food. That's almost all been contracted out. One of the reasons, in fact, if you look carefully at the distribution of GS positions throughout the federal government, why there's so few blue-collar jobs left is that most of them were contracted out as a result of what the Grace Commission did. But to fast forward, the challenge is that privatization now means a whole bunch of different things. We've pretty much have sold off most of what it is that the federal government does that can be sold off. And so, not to say there may be some nooks and crannies here that may be possible, but it's unlikely that this is what we're really talking about. But in what we're talking about today, the variations of privatization mean, first, what it is that Steve Goldsmith, used to be mayor of Indianapolis, called the Yellow Pages test. A page through the good old days when there actually used to be a printed telephone book. The Yellow Pages had a list of all the businesses, and if you could find a particular service in the Yellow Pages that government was doing, then government ought to contract that out because obviously there was a thriving private market for it. So there's an idea of trying to figure out how most easily you could hive off what it is that government does. Then there's the question of leveraging private sector capacity for production of government goods and services, especially goods, and that's NASA, the Department of Defense. One of the things that's fascinating now is that you look at SpaceX, we've had a major transition from the old days when NASA would specify in detail all the individual pieces and manage its own subcontracts with contractors out there. Now it's just saying, we want to buy some space launch vehicles, and we're going to just simply buy them not off the shelf, but from the goods that are produced by private contractors like SpaceX. Then there's contracting out for expertise to do government work. And these are service contracts where everything from planning to even preparation on occasion of government testimony gets done by private contractors. And the question here is, where does government authority lie? How much authority ought to be given to these service contractors? How much of a role should they have? What kind of responsibility should they have? And how do you get smart enough to be able to manage the people who are providing you with the expertise to begin with? And then finally, there's a mixed model in Project 2025 having to do with the National Weather Service. If you look at the weather forecast you have in your local TV stations every night, you can see lots of fancy graphics, and you have models for the future and the odds of precipitation. And what you're watching is a combination of some very good private companies that have developed super sophisticated graphics that the TV stations buy. There are models that are created in part by a European consortium that we're not part of but get access to the data for, but also an American model that the National Weather Service manages in coalition and partnership with a series of private universities and public universities where it's provided the cash to be able to create these cutting edge models. And then there are lots of other kinds of outfits like AccuWeather and others out there that are also providing the services. So Project 2025 says, well, if you can get forecasts from AccuWeather, why not just get rid of all the forecasting piece, keep the National Weather Service in the business of just collecting the data, and then we'll have a much cheaper and more efficient system. The problem with that, of course, is that first, not everybody has access to that. If you're living in some places, there may be places where it's just not efficient to be able to produce those local forecasts. There's a question of who it is who's going to provide emergency warnings. Who are you going to trust to hit the button when tornado sirens need to go off, or more particularly, who are you going to trust in forecasting the direction of hurricanes? And the problem there is that is now primarily a federal government activity through the National Weather Service, and that everything that you see on AccuWeather in terms of those warnings comes from the National Weather Service. So it turns out to be much more difficult to separate these things out. So it has to do fundamentally with the question of where does authority lie? The issues of gaining efficiency now have become buried in a whole host of other very big political and policy sets of questions that are at the core of a lot of what's in Project 2025.
So based on what's happened in the past, our country's experience with previous efforts and current efforts in privatization, what have we learned about how well it works to achieve the goal its proponents claim this privatization offers?
Well, you can imagine there's good news and bad news here. The good news is that privatization is how we got to the moon. Privatization is how it is we've launched the space station. Now, privatization is how now we have the rockets that are being launched to not only go to the space station, but also to the moon and then beyond. So it's worked pretty well for that. But on the other hand, there are some big concerns. One is this question about where you draw the line. And there are some companies that get more than 95% of their revenue from the federal government for these service contracts, and they provide a huge amount of advice. So sometimes it's a question of who it is who's the fully owned private subdivision and subsidiary of whom. Who has the authority here? So there's that question. And then there's more fundamentally than anything else, the ultimate question of if you're going to rely on market incentives, how do you know who to contract with? Because the whole business of private competition means that you deal with the choice of suppliers and you pick the most efficient one. How do you identify what it is that you want to buy? Because a lot of what the federal government buys is in a kind of off-the-shelf item like a memo pad from Staples. That you can't go to your friendly store and just simply buy an aircraft carrier off the shelf. And then lastly, how do you make sure that you actually get your money's worth for this? And the problem of trying to oversee the efficiency and the effectiveness of these contracts is very difficult, especially if we contract out the expertise to begin with. And so the biggest problems that we've had with waste, fraud, and abuse and other problems in contracts have come through a constellation of these issues. You might remember back in the Trump administration, there was furor about the fact that Trump's tax returns had been released, and rightly so. The individual tax returns of people are things that should not be released. Well, they were, but who released them? And the answer was a private contractor working for the IRS, not the IRS itself. And because the IRS had a hard time overseeing the contractor, had insufficient control over the person's access to the data, and the information got released. And why did the person do it? Well, the person who released it said that he thought he was performing a public service. So contractors get to decide what it is that's a public service on behalf of all of us. That's the biggest problem of all.
Thank you so much, Don. Liz, now over to you. So James also previewed the issue of expertise in the government and scientific expertise and integrity in particular. I wanted to ask you whether you could explain how scientific integrity and science-based decision-making is critical to agency decision-making.
Sure. So first, I will start by giving the definition of scientific integrity that we actually got just earlier this year from a cross-agency working group. And that is, scientific integrity is the adherence to professional practices, ethical behavior, and the principles of honesty and objectivity when conducting, managing, using the results of, and communicating about science and scientific activities. Inclusivity, transparency, and protection from inappropriate influence are hallmarks of scientific integrity. So that inappropriate influence piece is one that people are especially concerned about because it has been a big problem in the recent past. Now, I will say policy decisions are based on many factors, and scientific evidence is only one of those. But the key is for decision makers to be aware of and honest about the evidence that is relevant to their decisions. So for instance, when we have a pandemic like COVID-19 and a disease that is running through the population, the administration has to decide whether it's just going to let the disease run through the population or whether it's going to, for instance, release guidelines that will result in limited operations for businesses, schools, houses of worship, et cetera. And there isn't one just sort of easy, obvious answer here. There are trade-offs to any approach. But the important thing that I want to stress is that the decision should be informed by acknowledging the consequences and the benefits of either approach. And you shouldn't pretend that either one is without consequences or that there are no alternatives. And unfortunately, a lot of times what we see is politics interfering with that science piece. And sometimes that seems like it's done so that decision makers can pretend like there aren't any consequences to the policies that they're advancing. So we can see, for instance, political interference with data collection, that people are told to stop collecting certain kinds of data that shows that there are problems with a particular approach. People might be told not to report findings, for instance, that there are harms associated with a particular chemical. Reports can be suppressed. We can see instances actually where people are told to go back and reanalyze data to find some other finding than what they initially found, because that it doesn't conform to what the people who are pushing a policy want. So those are the kinds of things that we want to guard against in promoting scientific integrity. And the good news is that there has been strong bipartisan support for scientific integrity and for evidence-based policymaking in particular. And the most recent developments are around President Biden's presidential memorandum that he issued his first week in office, where he instructed agencies to either update their existing scientific integrity policies to meet certain criteria or to develop new ones if they didn't have them. So in the past few months, we have actually seen a lot of scientific integrity policies issued by agencies that do spell out ways that the agencies should be adhering to scientific integrity. And UCS actually just put, Union of Concerned Scientists just put out a report on a lot of these policies. I'll drop that link in the chat there.
Great, thank you. And thank you for a really great, clear, comprehensive definition of what these things are and how they can be implemented. So the next inevitable question, how does Project 2025 curtail the use of independent science-based decision-making and sort of overturn some of the gains that were just made?
So there are lots of specific policy proposals in Project 2025 that I'm alarmed by, but what I want to focus on right now with scientific integrity is two related threads that sort of run through the whole document. One is a disregard for and sometimes even hostility towards the expertise of career staff and also the advisory committees that provide expert advice. And then also a desire to focus on certain kinds of evidence and ignore others. So there are multiple proposals to eliminate various offices, actually even the entire Department of Education. And for example, the NOAA Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, the rationale for eliminating that is that it is a source of what the writers call climate alarmism. And so basically one way this can be interpreted is that these people don't want to do anything about climate change. So they're just going to eliminate one of the offices that is telling them that this is a problem and that there are things we can do about it. Similarly, there are multiple calls to eliminate offices and advisory committees that have the word equity in their name. So basically this similarly can be seen as an idea that if people don't want to do anything about equity, they can eliminate the people who are going to tell them that there are both problems and solutions around this area. And then there are also calls to replace current advisory committee members. And one thing we saw during the Trump administration was that the EPA administrator actually dismissed advisory committee members who received EPA research grants, claiming this represented a conflict of interest, but then retaining on the advisory committees the people who got industry funding for their research. So the result here is basically that agencies would be getting very biased and incomplete information, and then using that to support policy choices. And those policy choices then would result in weaker regulations, weaker protections, and worse public health outcomes.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. That's incredibly helpful and also really scary. So really everything that you all said is concerning and scary. But what I wanted to open now the questions to the audience and also questions to each of you, to each of the panelists. So given the severe consequences on key elements of rulemaking and the regulatory process, what do you think are actually the most dire elements of Project 2025 in this space? Liz, let's go to you first.
Sure. So I would say the loss of expertise and diversity from civil servants leaving agencies. Right now, we have a diverse workforce with a lot of skills and subject area knowledge and people who are dedicated to advancing agency missions. As Jeremy mentioned, there are a lot of actions in Project 2025 that would drive employees out of agencies. So if these places become miserable places to work, if scientists, for instance, are harassed for producing research findings that leadership dislikes, it's going to be very hard to attract and retain the kind of workforce we need.
Thanks, Liz. Don?
Top of my list, I think, is the lack of transparency. With all of what we're talking about, one of the biggest problems is that once you get beyond acts of Congress and executive order, it's going to be very difficult to actually tell what's going on the inside. Schedule F in particular allows the transfer of people in policy making or policy influencing positions into this new Schedule F, and then allows them to be replaced if they run afoul of the policies of their politicals who oversee them. How many people are actually going to have this happen to them? How many people are going to be put in Schedule F? How many people are going to be removed? What's going to happen with the people who are hired to replace them? What's the overall pattern and strategy, both by agency and by department? And the thing is that there is no transparency strategy whatsoever behind this. There's no requirement for reporting, and OPM, which traditionally has the role of collecting data, will in all likelihood be eviscerated as a result of all this and be headed by someone whose primary job is to try to encourage as much Schedule F as they possibly can. So what worries me most is the lack of transparency, and from the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability and oversight.
Thanks, Don. Jeremy?
Yeah, I agree with, all that. I think, the regulatory rollback element and then the inability to move forward when you're dealing with issues like unmet needs of communities overburdened by toxic pollution, or dealing with climate change and other pieces, like even stagnation is a lot, is a loss and at least direct harms to people. And then you start rolling back rules that save 200,000 lives. I mean, 100 million extra asthma attacks. That's I mean, just think any given one of those, someone right, with asthma, has got to reach for an inhaler or struggle to breathe. I mean, so those are real, but in addition, that's not the extent of it. I do really worry about what Liz was talking about. Every meeting, every event I've gone to with Michael Regan, he always administrative EPA Michael Regan, right? He's always made a point of calling out and encouraging young employees to sort of join the ranks of the agency, right? It's just been such a tremendous effort to staff back up an agency that really, was due for a generational sort of turnover. And that's started to happen, but turning agencies into toxic environments that people don't want to. I mean, the federal civil service should be made up of, should attract the best and the brightest, right? And, the diverse workforce and the young workforce that can, make a difference, not just for the next 4 years, but really for the next 4 decades. And that's all I risk.
Thanks, Jeremy. Though incredibly depressing. James, what do you think the most dire elements of Project 2025 are?
Well, I'm about to get more depressing, or at least horrifying. So it's just the sheer plausibility of it all, right? I mean, we're getting into like horror film season, and the ones that always hit me the most are the ones that are like have some element of plausibility to it. And I mean, I think what you've all just heard is stuff that is like uniquely or pretty closely within the president's sphere of power. And that's sort of the regulatory system in a nutshell. That is like an Article 2 thing. The president has just an enormous amount of influence to shape how the regulatory system is set up and how it works. And that gives him or her an extraordinary amount of leverage for changing things to produce substantive outcomes they want. So I know when people tend to think about Project 2025, they, what are the attack lines you often hear? Well, it wants to repeal Department of Education. Well, that's true, but that requires an act of Congress. That's not going to happen. It wants to return us to the gold standard. Terrifying, but not going to happen. Requires an act of Congress. But doing things like shipping EPA officials all over the state to force them to quit, attacking agency scientists, to a certain extent, privatizing things. These are all things that are plausibly within the existing legal authorities of the president and can be basically done by written down on a cocktail napkin. And even things that are a close call, well, you got to take that to the courts, the federal courts. And I don't know if you all have looked at the federal courts lately, but they're not our friends. They're on Team Project 2025 for the most part.
Okay, so now on a more optimistic note, perhaps, what do you think the best public interest response should be to the proposals to thwart the regulatory process contained in Project 2025? Obviously, we're meeting here today. One of the things that the public interest community has clearly done is to create transparency, make sure people know about this, talk about the ways in which it makes government thwarted and creates inabilities to act in so many different areas. But what else? What else do you think the public interest response should be? Don, I'll go to you.
Just first of all, to echo what you just said, I mean, transparency. There's a story that's just out today from ProPublica that investigated the strong pressure by politicals to try to force career experts inside EPA to change their professional judgments on some dangerous chemicals. And so getting the word out about that, I think, is tremendously important. And in particular, then trying to increase the case for transparency. Along the way, what's going to be crucial, I think, is just raising questions. What's going on? It's going to be essential to get beyond the individual horror stories and case studies and examples to broader pieces of evidence that I think have to be done. I think that it's obviously a court strategy is going to be important, but I think that the courts are going to take a while to decide these things. In some of these cases, in fact, There is a pretty strong case under administrative law that the president has the power to do a lot of this stuff. And so by the time we spend 2 years finding that out, it might be too late because a lot of changes will already have taken place. So I think that going back to the transparency thing, it's crucially important, especially to engage the media on this so that there's something that they have to be able to sink their teeth into. And then finally, I think one of the things that I've picked up along the way talking to lots of feds, but which there hasn't been much action on yet, is providing a kind of survival strategy for federal employees who find themselves in the middle of such a thing. There are some things that are legal, some things that are not, some things they must do, some things that they can't do, some things that they shouldn't do. And finding strategies for supporting people in the middle of all this and providing a kind of survival guide, I think, is crucially important, because that could make the big difference in the first days and weeks and months should this start to come to pass.
Thank you, Don. Liz?
So since I'm talking about scientific integrity, one important thing is to support passage of the Scientific Integrity Act. This is a bill that Representative Paul Tonko has introduced in this Congress as well as previous Congresses. Right now, scientific integrity policies that agencies have, they have because of a presidential memorandum, but that is easily revoked. Whereas if Congress were to require these policies, then it's much more likely that they would actually remain in place, and then people would be able to challenge violations. And many of the things that we are seeing proposed under Project 2025 would constitute violations of scientific integrity policies of different agencies. So this would provide a tool for people to stand up to some of that.
Thank you, Liz. Jeremy, what do you think the public interest community should do in response?
I agree. I think I just put a finer point on transparency. I think what we're dealing with will be, right, a systemic lack of transparency, right, and attempt to confuse and mislead. And it's a real problem when the institutions that policymakers and the media have relied on for nonpartisan and impartial information become the opposite. And so the lessons from Environmental Protection Network was during the Trump years was, again, the organization was founded during the Trump administration to be an independent voice of experts, largely EPA alumni, and ended up working with thousands journalists that were covering thousands of stories over the course of those years. And so I do think that I think it's more than transparency, right? It's sunlight, right? And shining the spotlight. Sunlight's a great disinfectant. It's not sufficient, but it is essential that we empower the public to know what's really going on, because they've gotten much more clever. You can see it too, even how the EPA chapter is written. Some of this stuff was pretty clunky, but the EPA chapter, even though the agenda clearly has gotten even more reckless and ambitious, the wording has gotten much more careful. And Mandy, who wrote that chapter, she has a book coming out, according to Politico, next month called "Y'all Fired." But the subtitle is more about like federalism, right? They're going to be talking about things like when they dismantle, right, the federal government, they're going to be, making claims about empowering states and stuff, when really they're just stripping money of states alongside, and federal resources that go to states alongside. So I think just having to be really active in establishing credible, independent expertise that can serve as a barometer for the media and the public on what's really going on is going to be really important.
Thanks, Jeremy. Those are really good points. James, too many James. James, what do you think the best public interest response should be?
Yeah, so I painted a pretty bleak picture, and I'm going to add to it now. Sorry, everybody. Yeah, sorry. So the important, I know a lot of people like to refer to this as like Trump's Project 2025, and I sort of the politics behind that. But the fact of the matter is this is much bigger than Trump. This is not just Project 2025. This is Project 2029, Project 2033, and I can't do the math beyond that. Sorry. what's in what that means is we got to think bigger picture, right? In referring back to my earlier point, like a lot of this is within the possible political power of the president. There just aren't a lot of like institutional levers that are available to advocates, and I don't want to discourage people from using those levers. Use them, but I do want to say that we need to think a bit bigger picture, um, and the reason for that is in essence, Project 2025 runs totally counter to everything we've ever thought about the conservative movement. It's in fact a vision of a big administrative state, right? And historically, we've been sort of taught that they just want no administrative state. They want to shrink it down to the size that they can strangle it in a bathtub. The political landscape has shifted, and we as progressive advocates have to keep up with that. And if we're going to have a debate over a big administrative state, we as progressives have to be clear about what we want from a bigger administrative state. And so I think that's what we, in addition to doing all this triaging and fighting in the trenches, we also need to think bigger picture. Like, what is it we want from the administrative state? What is our progressive vision for the administrative state? And I think once you sort of build that vision, you have that kind of platform to stand on. It makes these other fights a little more coherent and gives you a little firmer ledge or foothold to fight them from. So yeah, that's my idea.
Thanks, James. Just wanted to reiterate that the audience is welcome to ask questions. So if you have a question, you want to ask a question, feel free to post it in the chat, and we still have enough time I could call on you. But as you're thinking about your questions, I will ask another one. How do the specific elements in Project 2025 impacting the regulatory process? So all of the things that you each talked about, and maybe some that you have not yet discussed, combined together to fulfill a vision for vastly limited government action. Maybe a little bit in contrast, James, you just talked about, this actually isn't necessarily making a smaller regulatory system. It could be making a larger one, but what is clear that even in a larger, broad government institution, it's calling for vastly limited government action, or government action in the way that we as a community see it to fulfill its mission. So how do these things layer on top of each other to sort of fulfill that limited government action?
I'm happy to take a stab at that.
Great, thank you, Don.
One thing that I think is probably the case about Project 2025 and especially Schedule F is that they really are not going to fire 50,000 people. That would be insane because they know that they couldn't possibly find 50,000 people to replace them. What they are likely to do, I think, is to identify a few people. There was the ProPublica story today about 3 scientists in EPA who crossed them in terms of their scientific judgments. And so you could identify a few people that you could put into Schedule F and then fire. And that gets the word out to everybody else. So that back in the old days, in fact, of Henry VIII, they dealt with intimidation by just executing a few people and putting their heads on spikes around the Tower of London. And so I think that strategy is what is likely to happen. And other people who work for EPA seeing the heads on the spikes are likely to get the message and so dive for cover on all this. So that the easiest way to try to roll back the administrative state quickly is not to fire everybody. It's just to fire a few people, to make examples of them, to get the word out that this could happen to you as well. And then people simply pull in their horns. They're less aggressive in the policy positions that they frame. They're less aggressive in their scientific judgments. They back away more quickly if they're contested. And so you can undermine the regulatory power. And let me add one other thing that had to do with enforcement too on top of that. So you can back off on that, especially given the Jarchese decision that the Supreme Court came out with at the end of the last session. So by doing all of that, what you can do is to essentially intimidate people, and by that process of intimidation, not only roll back the number of regulations You can roll back the interpretation of the regulations, you roll back the enforcement of regulations, and you can deregulate in a massive kind of way very quickly without really having to fire very many people.
Thanks, Don. Liz, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree absolutely with everything that Don said, and that's a huge concern. I think also, certainly at least initially, it's not that we'll see so much less government, it's that we will see much more biased use of the existing rulemaking infrastructure. So like I mentioned, they're going to try and redo advisory committees, get rid of certain offices that they don't like, put a lot more people in, probably based on the kinds of decisions that they expect them to make, the kind of research findings they expect them to come up with. So I think we're going to see sort of a co-opting of the idea of evidence-based decision-making, and they're going to claim that's what they're doing when really it is not what they would be doing.
Thanks, Liz. James.
So, I mean, the conservative movement has been attacking, or has been trying to deconstruct the administrative state for a long time, for over 40 years now, right? They've got pretty good at it. They have a lot of tools at their disposal. And I think it was Don during our prep call used the great metaphor. Project 2025 is like their greatest hits of all that stuff. And so if I can steal that metaphor and in fact add to it, it's more than just their greatest hits, right? It's also like digitally remastered and optimized for your high-end homes stereo equipment, right? It's just everything in there, and it all sort of interacts in these synergistic ways. And the end result is you have agencies that are just straight up incapable of doing the mission that Congress has assigned to them in any sort of meaningful way. So you add new procedures, you make them do new analyses, make it harder to do things like guidance documents, and at the same time you make their employees afraid to do their jobs, right? You take away key tools like access to scientific studies by putting them off limits in various ways. You make it harder to bring in outside expertise like scientific advisory boards. It's not just any one of these little things, it's all of them together and then cranked up to 11.
Thanks, James. Jeremy, do you want to add?
Well, let me just add a hopeful note as we run down the clock here. I think, again, I think one of the reasons I work with EPN is because I think they were really successful for one reason in the Trump years, that this is sort of an extension in the next phase, right? I think that reason is that people actually care about this stuff. They just don't know about it, right? It's like people really don't want the government to be taken off the case of holding polluters accountable and standing up, for their rights, an EPA. And I think that's, that's equally true in other areas of this work. People depend on a functioning professional civil service that pursues its job, from across Republican administrations and Democratic administrations. Yes, you get different rules as a result, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're really talking about trying to pull one over on the public. So I think we, have that working for us.
Thank you. I want to try to get in one question quickly from the audience, and it seems to be best directed to you, Jeremy. This is from Matthew with the American Lung Association, and he asked, to what extent do we see a Project 2025 administration gut environmental clean air regulations?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very direct. Those 16, rules that, we picked, which we kept it with clean air rules to keep it manageable, the project, but those are the 16, big ones. I mean, they're coming for pretty much all of them. And Last time they lost a lot of this stuff in the courts because they had this guy, Scott Pruitt, who didn't do, as ALA knows, wasn't the smartest, brightest bulb in the box when it came to, how to actually get things done legally. But, they're not going to waste their opportunity this time to try to, if nothing else, pull things back, take things back another decade when we need to be moving forward, because as ALA, puts out in their, their really important state of the air report, it's like half the country or more people still live in areas where they're breathing unhealthy air. And we have, lead pipe still throughout this country. We have forever chemicals right in our water. We have problems that need to be addressed. We have microplastics. We have other things we need to be moving forward on, not back on. So I think on air pollution in particular, that's a huge source of the money that drives the Project 2025 agenda, and the bigger ecosystem behind them is from polluters that want relief from basic clean air standards.
Well, thank you all so much. I feel like this conversation went way too quickly, and there's so many more things we could discuss. But thank you, Liz, James, Don, and Jeremy. And because we anticipated that there were more things to talk about, we are having our second webinar in this series on October 9th. So be on the lookout for the invitation and the RSVP. So please join us then, and please join me in thanking our expert panelists. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks.
Thanks.